The Seminoles and Miccosukee tribes are matriarchal societies, tracing their lineage through their mothers. But while women are revered within these tribes and others, American Indian and Alaska Native women face particularly high rates of domestic violence. According to the National Indigenous Women's Research Center, 4 out of 5 will experience violence in their lifetime. This is part of the focus of a new course at the University of Miami's Native and Global Indigenous Studies program, or NAGIS. The course explores Indigenous feminism and highlights the negative role colonization continues to play within tribal communities. Joining me now to share more about this program and the violence against Native women is Caroline LaPorte, an immediate descendant of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, an associate judge for her tribe. Caroline is also a lecturer for the Native American and Indigenous Global Studies program at and director of Safe Housing for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Caroline, it is so wonderful to have you today. Thanks for joining me.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So we know you went to Law, but as a student there, you've said you noticed you were really the only Native American in your program. So talk about what that was like for you.
Yeah, I think, I want to say I think it's really challenging for most universities, or at least this is a challenge most universities could learn from, right? We need to find ways to address it. And we also think we need to think about why it's an issue in general. But for me, as a Native student, I just wanted Native community. Law school is challenging. Law school is challenging enough. And I think that, if I had had a little bit of more peer interaction, right, I might have felt more grounded throughout that whole process. It can be really isolating not to have that. But it can also result in indigeneity if it's even represented on campus, to be misrepresented or appropriated in harmful ways. So I think as a Native student, just generally, this kind of speaks to any university, you have to struggle through having to explain some of that. And that's difficult and also adds to a sense of loneliness.
So it's really all about educating people in the most part, don't you think?
I think it is. And I think it's about drawing people in, right, rather than kind of excluding people out. I think that there is, when you say that you need more representation to sort of feel seen, right, I think there sometimes is this tendency to feel like that's a critique. And it's really not. It's just sort of it's more of just a request, right? But I think that it would have helped a little bit. I think the other thing that it results in is that you end up, right, without Indigenous representation on campus, you end up without class options. Talking about indigeneity, you end up without club options, without access to Native faculty, any sort of basic considerations around your cultural identity. And those gaps sort of feed off of one another in different ways.
Yeah, we know you've become an educator in that space. So talk about UM's Native and Global Indigenous Studies program, or NAGIS. How did this all come about?
Yeah, it really came about to just address some of those gaps that I identified, right? And I think as a student, I sort of had a unique perspective, or as an alumni, I had a unique perspective on it. But weirdly, I had the opportunity to guest lecture at the law school right before the pandemic hit, which I know was sort of a weird and isolating time for all of us. And Tracy Devine Guzman, who's a professor, was actually at the lecture. So we went to lunch afterwards. We started talking about the need for representation, and representation sort of being the lowest bar. And then she and another colleague by the name of Will Pessel submitted a ULINK grant application. That's part of their racial equity work that the university is doing, and the university awarded it.
What do you want students to learn? What's the goal here? What do you want them to walk away from this course knowing better that they didn't before going in?
I think one of the big things is just thinking about the ways in which we learn differently, right? So I really want them to understand that humor, land, kinship, connection, right, that those are all valid forms of learning. It's sort of a core part of my syllabus requirement, but they really need to consider who they are in relation to the material. So I want them to be able to connect with what we're talking about. I want them to leave really thinking about their own responsibility, about their own values. And yes, obviously, it is a class that infuses history and law. So they do have to understand U.S. history as it has impacted Indigenous people and think about law in a different way. But really the goal is to have them challenge some deeply and pervasively held perceptions. And I want them to leave my class with empathy.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these issues we talk about don't just impact Indigenous people. They just happen to impact them disparately and exponentially. And so if we can sort of talk about our shared experiences in that way, then it leaves people feeling, more included in what they're learning about, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And do you have any examples of things that students have revealed to you through this course that they've actually come to learn maybe about themselves or their connection to Indigenous people or to other minority groups?
I think the big thing actually has been students thinking about where they grew up. And not that that's sort of a basic sort of intro thing that we do in my class is thinking about where people are from, and whose land that they're on, right, and sort of their connection to that space, because those spaces are important to my students. The places where they grew up, they hold significance for them. And I think if I can get them to think about things that have happened there historically, then there's that sort of an interesting entry point for people to gain. But I also just think, in general, people just have a lot of similar shared experiences, especially in regards to, for example, like violence, which it's not always the easiest thing to talk about. But I think to build trust in that way has been important for the class too.
Yeah. So let's talk about that and your work focusing on violence against Native women. And women, by the way, are revered in most tribal cultures. I just went to the Miccosukee village a few weeks ago and learned that when I did my interview with Curtis Osceola Jr., that really women are at the center of the family. But research shows that 4 out of 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women will experience violence in their lifetime. So if they're so revered and are the center of the family, why is this happening? And why do you think these rates are higher for Indigenous women?
Yeah, I think they're high for a lot of different reasons, right? It's something that we've been exploring in my class. But one of the things that I try to get my students to at least acknowledge in the beginning is that the experience of violence for Native women has 2 main root causes. And you actually mentioned them when you were introducing, right? They're genocide and colonization. And like you said, most tribes are matriarchal. Not necessarily all of them, but most were. So when settlers came to this land, women and children were directly and strategically targeted for violence and separation. And that was sort of a continued act of political violence against the sovereigns that were here, right? Like long before the other sovereigns that sort of appeared. And then these acts of violence then spread, of course, into law and policy. One of the main reasons for violence in our community is actually jurisdiction. So it's a legal issue. So, you cited that 4 out of 5 Native women experience violence within their lifetimes. That is true. I myself actually am a survivor of sexual assault and stalking. But 97% of those women from that same study, which was a Department of Justice study, will say that it was a non-Native that actually perpetrated the violence against them. And that goes back to that Supreme Court case that I was referencing, which is called Oliphant. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that tribes had been stripped of their inherent authority to prosecute non-Natives for crimes that they commit on the reservation. It was somewhat addressed by the most recent reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act, but not entirely. And I think the perception that this gives to people that would be abusers is that they can come to Indian country and they can act with impunity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge issue, right? There's also like little to no law enforcement. There's general invisibility. There's a lack of prosecution. There's not a lot of services for individuals who need support. And then we have sort of these ongoing other political issues like around the extractive industries that I think really add to the experiences of violence people have.
So are you saying that a lot of the violence, the majority of the violence against women is being done by non-Native men?
It is being done by non-Native men, particularly within regard to sexual assault. And I know that is definitely a difficult statistic to hear. But this was a Department of Justice study that was released in May of 2016. If anybody's interested, it's actually called the Rosé study, and you can find that online.
We know, too, you're the director of safe housing for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. So we know how crucial providing safe housing and other resources is for survivors of domestic violence. But there are many layers, as you've been mentioning, barriers unique to the Indigenous communities. So talk about some of these issues, such as the ties to ancestral land, because some of these spaces and places are not on ancestral land. So these women are being taken away from their land, if you will, correct?
That is true. I think one of the biggest issues, and we just sort of see this in the work in general, is that housing is not available. And that's really not like that's definitely something that's historically been an issue in Indian country for a myriad of issues relating to things like the Dawes Act or the Homestead Act. But housing is an issue everywhere. Housing is an issue in all of our communities. We partner with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and so we have access to their referral database. And one of the things we know from that database is that there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters just kind of across the United States for people to access. But for tribes and for Native survivors who want to maybe access a domestic violence shelter that's culturally rooted, there are less than 50 tribal domestic violence shelters. That's not really meeting the need, right? When you consider the level of violence that's experienced, plus, as you mentioned, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. Another thing that I think impacts most everyone's community is the way we condition access to housing. We have sort of come to view it as an individual right, or something that you might have access to based on your own sense of personal responsibility, when in reality, housing is a basic human right. And so I think a lot of what we're doing at the center, at least, is having these conversations to shift people's mindsets around what housing access actually needs to look like, and what about our own mindsets maybe need to be adjusted a little bit to ensure that people have access to things that are their basic needs.
Yeah. So what are some of the resources then for Native women looking for a way out of a violent situation? What can they do?
Yeah, so the first thing that they should do really is reach out to the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. It is a peer-to-peer hotline that is confidential and 24 hours that will connect a caller to an advocate who is also Native for a warm referral. So, getting you to either like a transportation voucher that a survivor might need, a hotel voucher, connecting you to a program that can assist you with shelter access, for example, or maybe with finding any sort of alternate support you might need, like even therapeutic support. Yeah. Other important resources, NIWRC.org, where I currently work. I would definitely say like the Sovereign Bodies Institute, which does missing and murdered Indigenous women's data work. And then your tribal coalitions. So regionally, there are tribal coalitions that will focus on these issues, similar to mainstream or state coalitions.
Yeah, and we'll list all of those. We'll have those resources on our website for everybody so that they can easily access them. Yeah, of course. And before we let you go, what is it that you want people most to know about being an Indigenous woman, about Native people? What is it that people should walk away with, especially in Native American Heritage Month?
I think that people should walk away with an understanding that our worldviews and our value systems are just as valid, right? And that if anything, they offer an additional lens for people to look at what they're experiencing or how they're experiencing it. That it's just, that it is something that is vibrant, that we are a people that are still here, and that we are a resilient group of people.
Well, it has been wonderful and very enlightening to speak with you. Thank you again so much for joining us, and continued best of luck with all the work you're doing at the University of Miami and with everything else related to domestic violence. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.